As we're studying through John, tonight I will work through it, and next Wednesday Jordan will speak through it, and then the third Wednesday, he and I are going to kind of do a tag team on some stuff in the book. But tonight I want to consider some things from the Gospel of John chapter 5. Read with me beginning in verse 1, please. But after this there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For the angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well, and whatever disease he had. Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity of 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there, he knew that he had already been in that condition a long time. He said to him, "What do you want? Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put you into the pool of water when the water is stirred, but while I'm coming, another steps before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well, and took up his bed and walked, and that day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It is a Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed." He answered them, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" Then they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. Afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you've been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father's been working until now, and I've been working." Therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he had not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making him equal with God. Richard, I'm not getting a click on my thing here. Can you take over back there? I worked hard on this PowerPoint today. And I did this one all by myself. See, this is not the only miracle tonight. Yeah. So I don't want this thing wasted. Yeah. Thank you, buddy. John chapter 5 is a turn in the gospel. It's one of the dividing places. In the first 4 chapters, the thing that is repeated after everything that Jesus did says, "And they believed." Now, in John chapter 5 through chapter 12, the opposite is stated, "And they did not believe." So now we're dealing with those who would be adversarial with Jesus. The second thing that's worth noting in the beginning is that several times in this reading it talks about the Jews. Jesus is not being anti-Semitic here. John was a Hebrew and he's a Hebrew. But what he's talking about is a certain segment of the Jews. He's not talking about the general population of the Jews. He's talking primarily, especially in this text, and most of the time throughout the gospel this is the case. When he talks about the Jews, he's talking about the leaders among the Jews. Those who deliberately and willfully refuse to believe. And so that's a significant thing to put in place. The other thing that's interesting as we begin, and not to be too critical of this, because I think the flow of it still fits, but those who have a higher criticism, and I'm talking about the textual analysis stuff, not people who are nitpicking to find a fault. Verses 3 and 4 are not in the manuscripts. They've been supplied, but they well fit as a commentary of what is taking place. So read verse 1 and 2. Now there was a feast of the Jews. Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Verse 2. Now there's in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. Verse 5. Now a certain man was there, who had an infirmity 38 years old. That's the flow of the text. But verses 3 and 4 well well describe the background of what is taking place here as you begin to look at what is happening in this text. So we're trying to look at things from the Gospel of John about he came for days like these. Well, what kind of days like these did he come from? I call these days of healing. He came for days like these, days of healing. And when we think about that, I want to look at it from three particular points and then break these down. The first is, he came for the story. There we go. Number one. Got it. We'll go back to the old way. Number one. Okay. For the story. Now, I'm going to break the story down into four different parts. First is the question that Jesus asked. The second has to do with the command of Jesus. And the third has to do with the warning of Jesus. And then the fourth part of this has to do with the protest against Jesus. So when we look at the story itself, you have this question of this man who's been infirm for 38 years. Do you want to be made well? Now, I don't know how you look at things like this, and I just find this kind of a humorous sort of question. I don't know that Jesus is interjecting humor here, or it's a question that borders on incredulity, if you will. Let's see. Here's this man that's been lame for 38 years, and now then you come up and you ask, do you want to be made well? Yeah. The answer to that is an obvious, certainly. But here's this man who, a great multitude of people are here, sick and lame. But when the angel of the water moved, and this was kind of a superstition that was that day, whoever stepped into the stirring of that pool as it's boiling would be healed from that disease. So here's this man, and Jesus says, do you want to be made well? And the sick man answered and said, Sir, I have no man to put me into the water when the water is stirred, but I am coming, and another steps down before me. So then you have the command. The command is, Jesus says, rise and take up your bed and walk. And immediately the man was made well and took up his bed. Now, this man and Jesus depart. If you'd been lame for 38 years and now then here's this fellow that you meet, he says to you, take up your mat and walk. Wouldn't you like to know his name? Wouldn't you like to know who he is? But at this point in time, this man has no idea who told him to do this. And so you have this man that is told to rise and take up the bed and walk. But then you have this warning in verse 14. See that you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. Again, I find that kind of an incredulous thing that's thrown in here. That here is this man of 38 years that's been lame, and now Jesus says, take up your bed and walk. Oh, and one more thing. Sin no more. Well, I don't know if this man is like people in general, but people in general, suffering doesn't necessarily produce obedience. In fact, how many times do you hear of someone that is suffering and they say, Lord, if you'll make me well, I'll. But then after the person gets well, they go on their way and they have forgotten what they have pledged that they would do. So obviously this man needed something more than just being able to be made to walk. Here this man, you need to be healed of your bitterness. You need to be healed of your attitude. There's something that is still there with you. Yes, you've been made to walk, but you go and you sin no more. That's the command that Jesus gives this man. But then the most amazing thing happens here in verse 16. Here you have the protest. For this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him. Why? Because he'd done these things on the Sabbath. Now Jesus had not violated the Sabbath. He had violated one of the 39 rules that they had made up to regulate the Sabbath by one of their traditions that they had established. In fact, if you go back to verse 9, immediately the man was made well and took up his bed and walked, and that day was the Sabbath. And now then, because it was the Sabbath, they determined to kill Jesus. You see, chapters 1 through 4, people are following. But now beginning in chapter 5, going forward, everything Jesus does, he knows, is setting him up with a big bullseye on his back. Now they are determined the more to kill him. And again, that's a little amazing too. That what you would do is you would accept the darkness of the Sabbath rules that you have made as opposed to the light of the miracle that's been made here. In fact, Jesus answers in verse 17, "My Father has been working until now, and I have been working." In other words, don't you realize that on the Sabbath the Father still works? Don't you realize on the Sabbath the sun still rises and the sun still sets? Don't you realize on the Sabbath that babies are born and He gives life? Don't you realize the Father still works on the Sabbath? Yes, He created in 6 days, and on the seventh day He rested. He stopped that formal creation. But in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3, it says that Jesus, who is the Creator, upholds all things by the word of His power. That word is still working on the Sabbath. And here now is the one who is, listen, who is God in the flesh. Remember chapter 1, verse 14? He became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, here is that flesh. He said, we beheld that flesh that dwelt among us, bringing grace and truth. In the beginning was the Word, where the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and that Word became flesh. Now, here is that Word that was God. Here's that Word that created, and here's that Word they beheld, the grace and truth, and He now is performing this miracle on the Sabbath. God in the flesh is doing this, and they get it. They get it. He's made Himself equal with God. Well, that gets Him in trouble too. And throughout the rest of John, you have this adversarial relationship that happens. Jump ahead just a little bit to chapter 11. It'll be a lesson we cover later on, a few lessons down. But in chapter 11, he got in trouble because he raised Lazarus from the dead, and they didn't believe. Mary and Martha have trouble with that for a while. But here he does this on the Sabbath, and what he lets them know is what Mark says in his gospel: the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Father is still working on the Sabbath, but all they can see, they can't see this man that they've known, that probably they have passed by time after time, lying there, waiting for someone to put him into the water while it stirs, that he might be healed. Passing him by. And now then this man of 38 years of infirmity arises, takes his bed and walk, and the only thing they have to say about that is it happened on the Sabbath. And then one of their rules was you can't carry your bed on the Sabbath. So what gives you the right to do that? The fellow that told me I was healed? Well, who told you were healed? I don't know. We parted. But then Jesus comes again and reveals Himself to them, and now He identifies Himself as Jesus, the one who had healed him. So basically, that's the story that you have. You have the question, do you want to be healed? Obviously so. Jesus is appealing to the man. Then you have the command, arise, take up your mat and walk. Then you have the proposition, the warning of Jesus that is given there. And then you have the protest against the Jews. That's the development of what the story is here. We go to point number 2. And point number 2, you have the power of Jesus in this. And there's some things I want to take away from this story that I think relate to this story being that which we have for times like these. The first thing I would suggest to you is that Jesus cannot be bound by time. Jesus cannot be bound by time. Here the text says this man has been lame for 38 years. And though this man has been lame for 38 years, it's nothing to Jesus. He is not bound by time. They might have thought he was, but he is not bound by time. And I think that's significant for me and you. We'll come back to that in just a little bit later. The second thing is that Jesus is not bound by tradition. They had made these laws. They had made these hedges, if you will. In fact, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, you have the denunciation of all these things, the hedges that they had made. It wasn't just the law they were concerned about. They made hedges to protect the law. The Pharisees did. Now, in Matthew chapter 23, the Lord says, if you want to know the law, ask a Pharisee, because the Pharisees knew the law. But then he said, don't do like they do. Because here this man is healed on the Sabbath, and now they take this man and they impose a law they had made over this man and said, you can't carry this bed. And Jesus is not going to be bound by their traditions in that. He's not going to be bound by that. He's not going to be hedged in by their laws. It's okay if the tradition we use is the Word of God. In fact, Paul will use it that way in a number of his writings, the tradition which we spoke to you. But we do ourselves no favor when in the process of that we put hedges around that to protect the Word of God. You know, we will talk about imposing on silence. That's one thing. But then what we do, if we're not careful, is we build hedges to protect where God has spoken. That's the same violation, just the other side of the coin that he gives here. But Jesus is not going to be bound by the traditions that they have. He's not going to be locked in by them. And then the third thing that you see here is Jesus cannot be bound by terror. In fact, when you think about this, you think about the tradition and the terror that's here. When you think about the tradition, I wonder if his disciples thought, you know, Lord, every time you do something like this, and it's on the Sabbath, we get in trouble. Don't do that. Just don't do it on the Sabbath anymore. Don't go there. Leave that alone. Wait till the next day to do that. But here's the terror. And the terror is found in verse 16. For the Jews sought to persecute Jesus and to kill him because he'd done these things on the Sabbath. Jesus does not relent from doing this because he fears that they are going to take his life. Now, he knows what they don't know. And he knows what we are told that they don't know. They're not going to take his life until he puts it in their hands. Time after time, Jesus was amidst the crowd, and he'd walk out of the crowd. They wouldn't know where he was at. His disciples tell him to, don't go to Jerusalem. He said, it's time for me to go. The time has come. But they're not going to take his life, but the disciples think they're going to take his life. But he's not going to be bound by their fear. He's not going to say, you know, I'm so afraid to do this. If I do this, I'm going to lose my life. Jesus didn't operate in the grip of terror. He wasn't afraid of what they were going to do to him. So that brings us to the third consideration. The third point, and that is, he came for days like this. So what are the principles to remember out of all this? I think the principles to remember is, number one, and this gets back to what I said a moment ago, Jesus could not be bound by time. Number one is this: no problem has lasted too long for the Lord. If he's not bound by time, no problem has lasted too long for the Lord. Now, let me take that just a little while. Here is this sin in my life, and it has been going on. It has been dominating me. It has been controlling me. I've been in the grips of this sin. I've been in the grips of this sin for 38 years. I've been in the grips of this sin for 40 years. This has gone on too long. The Lord surely can't take care of this. I've had this problem with something for 20 years, and it has been the thing that has been that which drags me down. You know, I've been lost so long. I've gripped the pew so many times. My knuckles have turned white. You know, it's just been too long. The Lord can't do anything about that. Listen, He not only is not bound by time, He's not limited by time by the problems that we have because they last too long. Wherever we are in our life, regardless of how long it's gone on, this miracle shows us that Jesus is equal to whatever that time is. He will tell a parable in the Gospel of Matthew about the men that make a deal to work in the vineyard. And those who come in the first part of the day make an agreement to work for a certain payment. And those who come in the latter part of the day agree to work for a certain payment. And it just so happens the payment is the same. The man who works 18 hours gets his denarii, and the man who works 1 hour gets his denarii. And there's trouble about that because it doesn't seem fair that here's the fellow been working 18 hours and he gets the same thing as the guy that works 1 hour. But what Jesus is telling them in that parable is It doesn't matter whether you come to the kingdom early or whether you come to the kingdom late. You get the reward. The reward is the same. And so it doesn't matter where we're at in our lives. Wasted years, if we wasted years in our life, it doesn't matter how many wasted years we have. He's not going to be limited by the number of years with which we have struggled with something or by which we've been in the grips of sin. Maybe there's a habit that we have. Maybe there's an attitude that we have. Maybe there are words that we speak. Maybe there's a relationship that is dysfunctional or skewed. And it's been that way for years. But the Lord is not going to be limited by that, however many years it takes place. And I find that comforting for us because we see things so finitely. But what He's telling us here is this is infinite with the Lord. We see things so finitely, and we look at ourselves in the mirror and we see how long we have been struggling with whatever the struggle is, and surely the Lord would not be gracious enough with us in that to heal us. But what He's saying is, it doesn't matter what healing you need. However long it's been, I will heal you. He came for times like this to heal us, regardless of how long the sickness has been. And I'm using that in the metaphorical sense of sin in our life. The next thing that we see, I think, as a principle here is that God always gives us the power to do what He said. God always gives us the power to do what He said. He says, go into all the world and teach. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be damned. Well, God gives us power to do what He said. God's not going to ask something of us and then not supply the power that is necessary for us to carry forth what He's asked us to do. In the second prayer that Paul will give in the book of Ephesians, beginning in verse 14 and following down, he talks about the family in heaven and earth. And he talks about being strengthened mightily in the inner man by the Spirit of the Lord, that we might know the height, the width, the depth, and the length of the love of God. And he speaks about the love of God that's immeasurable, that we might be filled with all the fullness of God. That's a concept that's hard to get our minds around. That we may be filled with all the fullness of God. Then he says, now to Him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all we ask or think. Is He going to say that and then leave us hanging? He's giving us the power. He gives the power to do what He said. That's why Paul could utter something like he does in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And he says that in Philippians chapter 4, beginning in verse 11, following down through verse 13, of a man who has been without and a man who has had plenty. And he said, I learned contentment with that. I learned contentment because I can do all things through Christ. He gives the power to us to do what He said to do. So whatever command we look at, whatever command that Jesus gives, here He tells this man, take up your bed and walk. He gave the man power to do what God asked him to do. Whatever the command that Jesus gives us, it's not going to be that we're left impotent to carry that out. He's going to give us the power that we need to carry that. And then the third and final thing I would say is that God is displeased by man-made limits. God is displeased by man-made limits. I said before, Jesus cannot be bound by tradition. And I tie that in with this. Here's this man who has just been healed. And the only thing they can think to say of him is, you are carrying your bed on the Sabbath. Nobody's rejoicing. Nobody's saying, hey, come over for dinner, let's talk about this. I've been passing you by for 38 years and letting you waddle there while somebody else jumped in ahead of you. And now then you've been made well. And they just heap upon heap upon heap. Well, can we not make the same mistake if we're not careful with, here's someone who obeys the gospel of Christ. They're new babes. And they have all the idiosyncrasies and habits of the world. They don't have the refined nomenclature that is in the Church of Christ dictionary. They don't have all the refined dress and the refined habits. And now they are as newborn babes, and they bring everything they've had in the world with them. They don't look like everybody else. They don't talk like everybody else. They don't fix their hair like everybody else. They wear clothes different than anybody else. And then what we do is we say, you don't need to dress that way. You need to do this, you need to do that. And what we do is we do the same thing they did, and still rejoicing that here's someone from the grossest experience of the world that comes to Christ and is baptized and has their sins washed away, and the tears come unbidden by that. The first thing we say to them is, now let me tell you how you have to dress. Now let me tell you how you have to talk. Here's the Church of Christ dictionary. Learn the words. No, what we've done is we've done the very same thing that they have done. And what God says is, I don't want your limits. I don't want what you have made a hedge with. I don't want how you have hedged yourself about to be imposed on this person. I just want this person to be mine and mine alone. You leave your hedges alone with that person. And give that person time. And that person will grow. And that person will develop. And then all those things that you see as warts and as fleas and ticks that bother you, all those things, they'll go away because transformation will take care of those things. Jesus came for days like this. He came to tell us with this man that when we baptize somebody off out the street, out of this world, understand they're going to be like this man. And what we need to do is we need not to impose things that are our demands upon them, but help them know and see the Lord more. I don't dress like I dress because of some code that says preachers dress this way. I dress like I dress because it's me. It goes back to my raising. It has Jess Jenkins all over it. That's me. There's one time of the year that I don't do this. It's during the blast. Because I want to identify with the kids. Don't wear your pants. You wear your tie. You wear your dress. No. That doesn't make us spiritual. That just may be who we are. Being spiritual is something different. It grows out of our relationship with the Lord. And what we want to introduce people to are not our Church of Christ ways, but we want to introduce people to the Lord so they will be with Him in His church and not set standards that are unrealistic for someone that is new. One final story I'll tell. I'm not going to mention a name, but this is a real story. This is not hypothetical. This is a real story. This is not just a made-up story. I knew a young lady one time in my teenage years who was a very spiritually minded young woman. Her family wasn't necessarily spiritually minded, but she was very spiritually minded. And one day, she was invited into an assembly like this. And it just so happened that the local preacher began to study with her and to teach her. Now, the young lady wore dresses that might have been a little too high and might not have seen anything wrong with how she dressed going to the pool or the lake or anything like that. You know what the preacher did? He didn't say, now let me tell you, you can't wear that dress like that anymore. Don't come in this building like that. And you can't dress like that when you go to the pool. You're going to have to be clothed. You can't do that. That's not what he did. What he did was, He just taught her and gave her time to learn. And folks, sometimes we just need time to learn. And if we do that, it's not me imposing something on someone that will change them. It'll be the Word from He who is the Word and was the Word, who we beheld as grace and truth that changes our lives. Jesus came for times like these. Now, signs point to something. What does this sign point to? It points to a message. What's the message? It doesn't matter what your sickness is and where you are, how long you've been there. The great physician will heal, and He'll make the difference. Mike has got some things to say, and then we'll have a word of prayer, and then we'll have a song.